You're watching another 15-minute segment with Marcus. I'm sitting down with my good friend Anne Stava-Murray. She is a state representative out of Illinois. Again, she's one of the top elected officials in the nation. Anne has absolutely no problems or issues speaking her mind, and she's a true champion for the people. Anne, could you please tell the people a little bit about yourself?
Oh, sure. So I live in Naperville. I grew up there, and I actually moved back to be near family, raise my kids. I was just sort of going along in corporate America for after college, and I had always had these passions of issues that I cared about, but I didn't really give myself the proper time that I needed to pursue them. Mm-hmm. And so after having kids, corporate America isn't the nicest to women.
Right, yeah, yes.
So I opted out of that track and had some time on my hands, and I started community organizing, and we had the Naperville Women's March Action Group that I started. And from there, it just kept rolling, and all of a sudden I was running for office, and now I'm a state representative.
Oh, wow. So you really just got involved with the community and everything, just kind of grew legs, then you got to this level.
Yeah.
One of the things that I noticed about you, one of the things that I really did appreciate, my background, I was in criminal justice reform myself for 6 years. My focus was on re-entry, and one of the things that I wanted to ask you, particularly on the national level, what are some things that we can do to change criminal justice reform and make sure that people collectively have equity and equality?
Yeah. I think that's a really important question, and I think one of the things that we've been talking about as a body recently in the General Assembly has been the 13th Amendment and what the 13th Amendment carved out and didn't cover. And the idea that we still allow unpaid labor in our prisons, and there are people in prisons, and we know that disproportionately Black and brown people end up in our prisons. And they have families back home that need food on the table, that need, if they're going to be working, I believe that they should be paid for that work.
Yes.
So I think that's one small thing, but one big thing. And beyond that, I think we really need to be thinking about shifting our mindset as a nation, as a country, as a society, of how we're thinking about incarcerated people, and really start to think of them more as our neighbors and our friends, and as people who can and should be rehabilitated into our society to the extent that we can. And I think right now there's a very punitive mindset in a lot of people's minds, and that's a mindset that we need to shift in order to make sure that we have the proper programming in place and the proper investment into people, because these are, again, our neighbors, our friends, people who deserve a chance, another chance.
Oh, definitely. That all makes sense. From your perspective and just a lot of the feedback that you've gotten back from the work that I've done in criminal justice reform, specifically when you look at communities where people come from socially, economically disenfranchised backgrounds, one of the biggest challenges, and there are many challenges, one of the biggest challenges that I see is financial.
Yes.
Being able to find gainful employment once they are returned back to the communities, once returning citizens come back. What are your thoughts on that?
I think we need to be doing as much as possible to remove barriers to employment, remove barriers to housing, because a lot of times there's the housing instability that underlies things as well, that it's really hard to find a job if you have unstable housing as well.
Oh, exactly.
So
Yeah.
like, how are you even supposed to do that and have an address to put down on your application for employment or whatever else? So I think there's a lot of systemic barriers that we need to be removing. And I think one of the things that, one of the programs that's, I think exists in our state still and has been pretty good, is one that rewards employers for having people who have gotten out of prison and for hiring them. And so there's like a slight decrease on taxes or something like that.
Okay.
But I think anything that we can do to be rewarding that positive behavior of hiring people who clearly have a very strong skill set, and then also be making sure that we have the programming in place in the prisons that are to real jobs once they are out of the prisons. And so I think like one of the things that I had been talking about with the solar industry was getting getting training for solar into the prisons of like installation, or having like really trades type thing that could be make it a possibility afterwards to more easily get a job.
Oh, so the trades. So you think trades would definitely help out?
I think trades would definitely. I think if we can get trades more involved, that could help, because there's such a need in that area. I think having the additional education is important too, educational opportunities and attainment. And I know some of our prisons have that and some of them don't. And it's spottier for the women than it is for the men, depending on where you are and what facility you happen to be in.
Right.
But I know that education is huge as well, and being able to have that experience in different areas is very helpful.
I'm really glad that you spoke to education and addressed that as well, because that's something that people tend to overlook, because there are so many issues why a person is incarcerated. But I think one thing that it's a conversation that I rarely hear happen, and that is primary socialization as well as secondary socialization. What is actually happening in certain communities in the home, survival. It's not necessarily that people are bad people, but there could be a situation where there's no power in the house. You have a child growing up with no power. So there's not an incentive for the child to stay away from making illegal, currency at an earlier age. And there's certainly no incentive that a person can see in going to school, because they're, going to school in elementary school isn't putting food on the table right now when they're hungry right now. So as far as like some of the moral values that are forced out of certain homes in certain neighborhoods, simply because people are forced to survive, what do you think we can do about that? Because a lot of it is systemic. If that's the proper word. It seems it's generational. And this is, and it's
I think it's like we're getting to a bigger discussion that needs to happen at a national level on like reparations.
Oh wow.
Because I think like if you think about reparations, a lot of the households that are struggling to pay for power and that are in more at-risk communities in terms of poverty are our Black communities, and I think there hasn't been any meaningful reparations in this country, and so we need to think about that, and that certainly would give a lot of families a big boost and ability to concentrate on things like education and whatever else. And there's another like shorter term discussion on things like, okay, could we improve the food at schools? So that's actually an incentive for kids to attend because they actually want to eat their hot lunch, and it's not disgusting and not even worth, like, it's not like just like, oh, I'm hungry, but I just can't even eat this. So,
Yeah.
which is unfortunately sometimes the case with those lunch programs. So we actually have a bill that I don't think has passed yet that would allow people to not just take the lowest cost vendor for food for like schools. And that I actually think is kind of an important thing in the shorter term to make sure that people are fed.
Oh yeah, definitely. Okay, so wow, yeah, definitely education is a big one. Touching on that. So one of the things that I always thought about in re-entry, when a person is coming out of a correctional facility, and you clearly agree with me on this one and many other people from what you're saying and the hard work that you actually are doing in the General Assembly. But there's been a big focus on re-entry, as it should be. What do we do to help people is the question and conversation when they return to the communities. But one of the things that I always looked at was like, while re-entry is very important, we should be focusing on no entry.
Yeah, prevention.
As well. Where exactly, so we spoke on primary socialization, what's going on in the home. Secondary socialization, it kicks off what's happening in the communities, and you know, but like what can we do educational like wise, like what can schools do differently, because the sole responsibility doesn't fall on them. No one's trying to say that, at least many people aren't trying to say that, but what can schools do to help stop the prison pipeline?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that we could do is take police out of our schools. That is shown to increase the school to prison pipeline. And if they do absolutely need security, hire private security guards then and do it that way. But I do think that making our schools feel safer includes making sure that a group that has taken its power into its own hands at times in an unsafe kind of way for people don't have access to children in that setting, and making the educational environment as safe as it can be for the children. I think one of the other things, thinking about education and what can schools do, making sure that schools are more of a hub for services and social service programs. I think some schools in my area particularly try to do this and are interested in doing it more, but making it easier for families that if they're going to school, they can also have adjacent services that they may need access to, whether it be mental health services or just ability to integrate with other programs that are offered by the state or whatever it is, making it easier to access.
So something else that I just thought about, because when you mentioned like private security, so Illinois, prison-wise, is not one of those states, but certain states have privatized prisons.
Oh God, not in prisons.
What are your thoughts on privatized prisons?
I think they're terrible in general. I think that's where we see. I mean, I like that as a state representative in the state of Illinois, I can go visit any of our prisons, and I can and do that.
Yeah.
And feel like no one has the authority to tell me what I can look at or not look at in terms of like where our state dollars are flowing and how people are being treated. I think the privatization of prisons really needs to end. And that's a practice that's actually goes back to your first question, is a practice that we should probably end on a national level.
So do you think they actually could, do they have the ability to stop that on a national level? Or is it just statewide?
I think there has to be some mechanism at a federal level that doesn't allow for the privatization of those services.
With prisons being privatized, do you feel that encourages, so states that do have privatized prisons, and Illinois is not one of those states, but the states that do have privatized prisons, do you feel that, not in all cases, but in many cases, it provides almost an incentive to unfairly sentence people?
Yes, I think it provides an incentive to unfairly sentence people. It also provides an incentive to lock more people up for jobs purposes. I think that's a concern that we have even when prisons aren't privatized. There's an incentive in certain areas that their whole economy relies on the prison existing and having a large number of incarcerated people in it. And so I think that's really a problem, and we need to have a solution for jobs for those and economies for those areas that are not so reliant on the prison system and incarcerating people.
Do you ever think on a national level, I know different countries have different practices, but the dynamics of our country are obviously different than the dynamics with many others. Do you ever think we will see on a national level a significant decrease in the prison population?
I think that it's hard because I feel like on the one hand, there's the very pessimistic reality of the world that we live in and our country being the highest rate of incarceration. Like, could we ever not be the highest? I sure hope so. And I would like to help bring about that reality with as many people who are willing to try and help bring about that reality as well. And I think that's all we can do is keep working every day to bring that change about and continue focusing on making that happen.
One of the things, and my memory's like a little foggy on it because I left my post doing community outreach media, just basically trying to fight recidivism back in 2018. But one of the things that I remember were the numbers. At the time, I believe black people, African Americans, made up 15% of the state's population as a whole, but at the time, we represented 60% of the inmate population. So well over half, definitely over half of the inmates in the Illinois Department of Corrections were African American. What are 3 reasons behind that you think?
I think that obviously there's a lot of bias in our policing, and so black communities and brown communities tend to be over-policed, and just like a much higher police presence, even being between like where I live in Naperville, where I don't normally see police if I'm driving to the Park District, to going to Bolingbrook, where there's a larger black population. There's a police car in the it was like kids football, and there's a squad car that's present there, and police presence in so many different facets of life that like I think it's obviously not a different rate of crime between, and I think it's a matter of what is actually looked at and what is policed, and that there's a lot of crime that goes unpoliced in white areas in particular. And I think that's where we start to see the disproportionate numbers change in terms of how they're getting there. And then I think in terms of sentencing, you have another area where bias can creep in and stereotypes, and we know that disproportionately judges are white and disproportionately white men, and there are biases that come with that we see in sentencing. And I know that some of that led to sentencing reform in the wrong direction of like mandatory minimum sentences because they weren't treating people fairly. I don't think that's the right direction to get rid of bias, but that's certainly been a problem. And then a third reason I would say is the underlying structural racism that's built into so much of our systems that allow that to happen, and that the lack of opportunity and based on where your zip code is, and the deep amount of segregation that we still have in our country that is really been a problem in the way that things have resulted.
So I know we're getting closer to the end, and I really, really appreciate you doing this interview with me. This is something that the people collectively need to see. We need good discussions on criminal justice reform to encourage people out there who are in the field, whether they're attorneys, whether they're social advocates, where they're correct. Because, you know, one of the things I noticed at DOC, like my favorite aspect, I really liked when we were setting up for the reentry event. I used to like to sit down with the people who were incarcerated, and I used to just have like a meal with them. So we sit down and eat. But what would really be cool about that, some of the correctional officers who were on the same page, who were about fighting this too, you know, we'd all sit down as like a group. So to encourage people like that, with criminal justice reform and what you see happening, not just in Illinois, but on a national level, what are two of the main things? I think basically what I'm trying to ask, what is the most exciting? What do you think are the best practices right now that you see happening with criminal justice reform nationally? It can be anywhere in the country.
The best practices. Does it have to be our country?
No, it doesn't have to be. It does not have to be.
Because there was actually, and I'm gonna forget the country now because I'm on the spot. But there is
Switzerland.
Not Switzerland. It's in Northern Europe somewhere. But it was like they have the lowest incarceration rate in the world, and they have prisons, and they have actually culturally, and this ties back into earlier what I was talking about, a cultural perspective of seeing everyone as their neighbors and thinking about prison as rehabilitation as opposed to just punitive, like lock people away and throw away the keys.
Yes.
Attitude. And so I think that shift is really important for us to focus on, taking and changing society's attitudes as much as we can to realize the damage that we're doing to ourselves and to other people. Because I think it's not, I always think of that quote, like, no one is free until we're all free.
Yes.
And I think that there is a very obvious negative impact on all of us for this system that we've created that's so unhealthy for us. And so I think that as much as we can work on overcoming that and really shifting hearts and minds, I think that's where then we'll see the dollars committed to changing our system, because it's not going to be free to change it.
Oh yes. Nothing's free, and freedom is not free. You just watched another 15-minute segment of 15 Minutes with Marcus. You just heard from a state rep who is a social advocate for change, and she's gonna keep fighting for the people, and she just simply doesn't play games. We love her, we appreciate her, and we hope that we get to work with her for years. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.